This is part 2 on the lecture for the Muslim Caliphate, the 24th lecture for Ancient and Medieval Worlds. In the previous section, we covered the origins of the pre-Islamic Arabian society, or Arab society, as well as the first civil war that led to the creation of the Umayyad dynasty under Muawiyah. Muawiyah, as we saw, moved the capital from Medina to Damascus. And that's where we're picking up here. The Umayyads had a very rocky political start. Muawiyah managed to consolidate power and centralize authority under his role as caliph, but people were not happy with him leaving the title of caliph to his son. Remember that the Rashidun caliphs, who had preceded the Umayyads for that first generation of about 30 years after Muhammad, had been elected by and from amongst the members of the Prophet's inner circle, that is, Muhammad's close companions. Of course, many of these people were beginning to die off more than 30 years later, by the time Muawiyah was dead. Well, that's even more than 30 years later. He acceded to the throne 30 years after Muhammad's death. When Muawiyah died, there were immediately two rebellions against his son. The first was predictably one of Ali's sons, that is, the fourth Rashidun Caliph, Ali, who was the cousin and son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad. This son of Ali was a grandson of Muhammad, therefore his name was Hussein. Now, Hussein actually failed to attract much political support and was killed by Umayyad forces in southern Mesopotamia, in what is today Iraq, near Karbala. Which has become an important Shiite holy city as a response. Now, this seemed at the time to be the less important revolt because it had few immediate political implications, and Hussein didn't get a whole lot of political support, as I mentioned. But Hussein's death became a defining moment for later Shiites, and the festival celebrating Hussein's martyrdom, as Shiites describe it, is one of the key annual festivals that differentiate Shiite and Sunni to this day. The bigger immediate threat, this is in the 680s, that was the martyrdom of Hussein. Here we can see on the left the sarcophagus of the Imam Hussein, the third Imam, after his older brother and his father, Ali. The bigger immediate threat, however, was a revolt in Medina, which briefly created a breakaway state for, well, not that brief at the time, almost a decade. And it showed really the underlying tribal tensions present in this new Arab empire. Not all of the tribes who had fought in the wars of conquest were happy that the Umayyads had come out on top. This, interestingly, also had a long-term but unexpected religious outcome, because the Umayyads did not control Mecca and Medina for a period of a decade, and this was an extremely still formative period in the history of Islam. And the Umayyads began to prioritize Jerusalem, which they did control. Of course, that was making the Abrahamic connection, that is the connection to the older Abrahamic religions of Judaism and Christianity, which of course had both also held Jerusalem to be holy, and which of course, as I mentioned in the previous lecture on the birth of Islam, Islam also claimed descent from religiously. It was in this time period that Muawiyah's heirs built the Dome of the Rock over the site of the old Jewish temple, where Muhammad was believed to have journeyed by night to heaven. This is one of the most important stories in Muhammad's life for Muslims. The Dome of the Rock is an interesting structure. It's one of the oldest surviving structures built by Muslims, although actually Byzantine craftsmen were probably largely responsible for it, similarly to we saw in the last part of this lecture for the Great Mosque in Damascus. But this is a very different sort of structure. Now, the blue tiling was added later, and the golden-looking dome today is a more modern replacement, but otherwise the structure is still largely the same as was built in the 680s. It is not a mosque. And it's a common misconception for the Dome of the Rock. The Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is also on the Temple Mount, not visible in this picture, is only a stone's throw away. So there's already a mosque right there. That's not what the Dome of the Rock is for. It does not have a Qibla. That is a prayer niche that indicates the direction to Mecca. Now, there's a great deal of debate as to why the Dome of the Rock was built. The prevailing scholarly opinion today tends to be that it was in order to compete with major Christian shrines that were already in the city, like the Church of the Holy Sepulchre over the supposed location of Christ's death and burial. Which was really the dominant architecture of the city of Jerusalem and had been since the time of Constantine's conversion. So that's certainly very possible as one of the explanations for why the Dome of the Rock was built, Muslims sort of claiming a role in this important city to the Abrahamic faiths. But a major trend in scholarship, and this is actually the case from relatively early Islamic historians, they don't go all the way back to the actual eyewitness accounts, but from about 100 or 200 years later, some Islamic historians claimed that the Dome of the Rock had actually been built to compete with Mecca exactly in this period when Mecca was in open revolt. Mecca and Medina were in open revolt against the Umayyads. Now, this seems impossible until you consider that this is less than 50 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad and that Islam was still really forming its identity. A lot of the standards of practices and ritual were still being worked out, and it's entirely possible that that this was one of the reasons why the Dome of the Rock was originally built. If so, that reason was almost immediately dropped when at the end of the 680s, the rebellious province of the Hijaz, Mecca and Medina, was reconquered by the Umayyads. But it shows a sort of interesting point that shows how important Jerusalem is from very early on to Muslim religious sensibilities. And it also shows that this was still an experimental phase in Islam. The practicalities, the details of how Islam will work, its holiest sites, are still being worked out in this early stage, and how important the connection to the older Abrahamic traditions are. Now, the remaining Umayyad caliphs tried to consolidate power in the aftermath of these initial difficulties with the succession of the second Umayyad caliph from his father. These later Umayyad caliphs demilitarized the Arab tribes that had given them so much trouble in this second civil war that had briefly seen the breakaway of Mecca and Medina. Increasingly, non-Arabs would be brought into the armies of the caliphs. Islamic conquests, therefore, went from being a kind of tribal coalition loosely united by faith in Islam to a more traditional army of imperial expansion. Meanwhile, Arab tribal leaders were sidelined in favor of more traditional imperial bureaucracy, which still included Arabs but also non-Arabs, based on professional rather than familial relationships, and thus less of a threat to the Umayyads. At the same time, as a new generation came of age after 700, for whom the initial conquest was no longer a living memory, increasingly Arabic became the language of administration, and the caliphate began to develop its own systems of government, replacing the older Byzantine and Sassanid traditions. In part, this was Arabs coming into their own as imperial rulers, but it also meant non-Arabs began to adopt Arabic language and culture. Now, along with this was an increasing trend to conversion to Islam within the caliphate. And now, this was not initially encouraged, as I mentioned in the last part of this lecture. Not only was there an initial sense that Islam was for the Arabs, and a sense of Arab cultural superiority that with this, the idea that God had spoken to them in their own language. But the initial idea of the conquest seems to have been that the taxes of the non-Muslim population would pay for the Muslim masters of this new empire. And that wouldn't work if too many people converted to Islam and thus stopped paying the jizya tax on dhimmis in favor of charity, which was, as I mentioned in the previous lecture, outside of government control. But despite efforts to create firm divisions that I mentioned before, where there was this attempt to separate the Arab Muslim conquerors from the non-Muslim population, there was, of course, an intermingling between peoples and cultures. The architectural examples I mentioned already are just one surviving tangible evidence of this, as Muslims began to adopt older architectural styles and, in fact, even use non-Muslim craftsmen. Non-Muslims also wanted to join the ruling elite. or possibly just wanted to avoid paying the jizya tax, and that meant conversion to Islam. At first, this was largely confined to Arabs living in the conquered regions already, although many of these Arabs remained Christian or Jewish and still do down to this day. But increasingly, non-Arabs converted as well, particularly in Persia, where Zoroastrianism effectively collapsed. Christianity survived much more effectively in the conquered regions of the former Byzantine regions. Now, we do not know the rate of conversion. It's a hotly contested topic in academic scholarship. It was definitely not a majority of the population. A majority of the population, at least in the western portions of the Middle East, probably didn't become Muslim until that tipping point probably doesn't come until the period of the Crusades, 4 centuries after the initial conquest. But enough people from the region converted who mattered in terms of political and economic authority to become an issue in this very hierarchical pre-modern world. And this was one of the factors that brought down the Umayyad dynasty. The Umayyad dynasty faced several problems. For one, they had economic problems. Rising conversion among the elites reduced tax revenue. And to compensate, the Umayyads kept trying to expand the empire to get more booty from conquest, but in the process, they overextended and exhausted their military. Muslim forces started losing, and notably, they never managed the great Umayyad goal of taking Constantinople from the Byzantines. Meanwhile, the Umayyads kept trying to tax non-Arab Muslims who had converted, and they even tried to tax Arab Muslims. Obviously, neither group was particularly thrilled with this policy. There were also continuing religious divisions in society, and the Shiite cause for seeking a ruler from the Prophet's family, although not yet fully developed, exerted a powerful appeal in this time period before people began really thinking of themselves as Sunni or Shia. Resistance began in several places simultaneously, but a descendant of Muhammad's uncle, that Muhammad's uncle being named Abbas, ended up leading the way and sort of piggybacking on the Shiite cause despite not being descended from Ali personally. This first Abbasid caliph managed to overthrow the Umayyads and quickly dropped the Shiite pretensions in favor of the more mainstream position that was becoming Sunnism, and he began the Abbasid dynasty in 750. This Abbasid dynasty benefited from inheriting the institutions that the Umayyads had developed, but also perfected them into a now uniquely Islamic culture, and many Muslims continue to see the Abbasid era as a golden age. It helps that we have far more surviving records for the Abbasid era than we do for the first 150 or so years of Islamic history. And that's something that I want to emphasize here. I've mentioned already that there are several areas that we've discussed in this lecture that are the subjects of intense scholarly debate. Part of the problem is that there aren't a lot of surviving sources from this critical time period. And that has made it very difficult to get scholarly consensus on certain extremely important issues. I once heard an Islamic scholar refer to this first 150 or so years as attempting to squeeze blood from a stone, which I think is a particularly evocative metaphor for the historian's job in a period with limited textual sources. All right, that's the end of part 2 of this lecture. I will continue on with the Abbasids and their eventual breakdown in authority in part 3.